This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony. W.H. Auden was a 20th century British poet and man about the arts whose influence extended beyond just literature. In the 1950s, he wrote the librettos for Stravinsky's The Rake's Progress and other operas, but the height of his fame had come in the late 1940s when he wrote an extended poem called The Age of Anxiety. It's about three men and a woman who meet in a New York bar, each looking for some kind of cure for boredom, loneliness, and lack of purpose. Or, if not a cure, at least a means of forgetting their situations. The poem follows their thoughts and their conversations through a long night, with interruptions from commercials and radio broadcasts of war news. Eventually, they move from the bar to an apartment, where they become more and more isolated in their search for faith. Finally, at dawn, they say their goodbyes and promptly forget each other's existence. Auden's poem won the Pulitzer Prize, and when Leonard Bernstein first read it in the summer of 1947, he became obsessed with the idea of writing a musical interpretation of it. He wrote what became his Symphony No. 2 in 1948 and 49, intending it as a musical evocation of the poem rather than a literal interpretation. But he later confessed to have astonished himself at how closely the music followed the poem, and the rhythms and melodies of much of the first half of the symphony are reminiscent of the sounds of 40s swing and jazz, the sounds that would have been heard on the radio in the bar where the four characters meet. There's also an elaborate solo piano part that runs throughout the whole piece. Bernstein later said that part of the piece was autobiographical, that the piano represents the elusive something that all the characters are seeking. In his case, the reconciliation of all the disparate parts of his personality in both the musical and personal senses. Bernstein wrote, "The pianist is set against an orchestral mirror in which he sees himself analytically in the modern ambience. The work is therefore no concerto in the virtuosic sense, although I regard Auden's poem as one of the most shattering examples of pure virtuosity in the history of English poetry." End quote. Throughout the work, the music gets more and more dissonant as the relationships fragment and dissipate. Bernstein wrote, "The essential line of the poem and of the music is the record of our difficult and problematical search for faith. In the end, two of the characters enunciate the recognition of this faith, even a passive submission to it, at the same time revealing an inability to relate to it personally in their daily lives, except through blind acceptance." End quote. But the piano remains above it all until, as Bernstein put it, a final chord of affirmation at the end. The poem is in 6 sections, which Bernstein divided into 2 large parts, each containing 3 sections played without pause. Here is how he described it. Part 1. The prologue finds 4 lonely characters, a girl and 3 men, in a Third Avenue bar, all of them insecure and trying, though drunk, to detach themselves from their conflicts, or, at best, to resolve them. They're drawn together by this common urge and begin a kind of symposium on the state of man. Musically, the prologue is a very short section consisting of a lonely improvisation by 2 clarinets and followed by a long descending scale. The scale acts as a bridge into the realm of the unconscious, where most of the poem takes place. The 7 Ages. The life of man is reviewed from the 4 personal points of view. This is a series of variations which differ from conventional variations in that they do not vary on any one common theme. Each variation seizes upon some feature of the preceding one and develops it, introducing in the course of the development some counter feature upon which the next variation seizes. The 7 Stages. The variation form continues for another set of 7, in which the characters go on an inner and highly symbolic journey according to a geographical plan. Leading back to a point of comfort and security. When the 4 characters awaken from this dream odyssey, they are closely united through a common experience and through alcohol, and begin to function as one organism. Part 2. The dirge is sung by the 4 as they sit in a cab en route to the girl's apartment for a nightcap. They mourn the loss of the colossal dad, the great leader who can always give the right orders, find the right solution, shoulder the mass responsibility, and satisfy the universal need for a father symbol. This section employs, in a harmonic way, a 12-tone row, out of which the main theme evolves. The mask finds the group in the girl's apartment. Weary, guilty, determined to have a party. The party ends in anticlimax and the dispersal of the actors. In the music, the piano protagonist is traumatized by the intervention of the orchestra for 4 bars of hectic jazz. When the orchestra stops, as abruptly as it began, a pianino in the orchestra is continuing the masque, repetitiously and with waning energy, as the epilogue begins. The epilogue. What is left, it turns out, is faith. The trumpet intrudes its statement of something pure upon the dying pianino. The strings answer in a melancholy reminiscent of the prologue. All at once, the strings accept the situation in a sudden, radiant pianissimo. And begin to build, with the rest of the orchestra, to a positive statement of the newly recognized faith. End quote. In the end, Auden didn't care much for Bernstein's symphony. It really has nothing to do with me, he observed. Any connections with my book are rather distant, end quote. But for Bernstein, Auden's explorations of alienation, friendship, family, and faith were anything but distant. This is Rick Malone for the San Francisco Symphony.